Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out. I'm Ken Kreitner. I'm the chair of Kristin's doctoral committee, an honor I inherited at the point of the much lamented retirement of Dr. Peterson a few years ago. And I'm availing myself of the chair's privilege to say a few words of introduction before. I volunteered for this because of my general sense of showbiz. And as I contemplated, I realized I'm in the position of introducing Kristin to a lot of people who know her very well. And in fact, in welcoming her and many of you to your own house. So I won't go that way. I will say that a doctorate in music is hard to get. You have to take a lot of classes, you have to take a lot of lessons, and you have to do a series of formal recitals. Sorry, my mask is not working well. It's working well, don't worry. It's not staying up well. To do a series of formal recitals of the most demanding literature for your instrument, and at the end you have to do a big research project with a performing component, and that's what we're here for today. The last public performance of Ms. Lensch. Yeah. This one is different from many in two important ways. One, it's the only lecture recital I've ever heard that is about music that was being done in the very room where we are, which is a very cool thing, I think. And the other is that it's interesting. They aren't always, this is no secret, gifted musicians don't always have the gift of being naturally interesting. But today we all got lucky. The subject, Adolph Steuterman, and organ repertoire in early 20th century America, 1921 to 1924. Kristin, entertain us.
Hello, and thank you all for being here in person and on live stream. What a pleasure it is. This silver lining in this pandemic means that my first organ teacher in Florida, who's now in Florida, is online. My family in Canada is online and also in Iowa, and so that is a real pleasure for me to know that they're able to participate with me in this special day. Today's format is a lecture recital, as you heard, and so it's a little different. I'm going to be speaking as much as playing. So, giving you the essence of my research efforts and hopefully not causing you to fall asleep, but also demonstrating these different ideas by playing mostly excerpts. So there's no need for applause during the course of this recital, because sometimes it's just snippets of little pieces. I'll also be referring to a couple of things I have on display down here. You can see Adolph Steuterman quite well right there, sir. So you're welcome to come up and look at them as long as you maintain your social distance, but you're welcome to come up and look at these things at the conclusion of the recital. So it's my pleasure today to present to you the topic of my dissertation, Adolph Steuterman and the organ repertoire he played here at Calvary early in his 56-year tenure as organist choirmaster during the years 1921 to 1924. Very little is known about the music that church organists played on a regular basis in the early 20th century in a mainline Protestant church. But Steuterman documented everything he played in journals throughout his career, all preludes, postludes, music played during communion, and his recital pieces. Examining this body of repertoire gives us a snapshot of the work of an organist choirmaster in the 1920s in a larger metropolitan area, and it also reveals the larger trends of organ music at the time. So let me first tell you about Adolph Steuterman. He was born in 1893 and grew up in a musical family. His father was a harpist for the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, and his brothers also played piano and violin along with him. They moved to Memphis in 1899, and Memphis was one of the largest cities in the South at the time, even larger than Atlanta. Memphis had its own symphony, its own professional symphony orchestra. Organist rule, however, sorry. I have organist on my brain. Memphis had its own symphony orchestra and a very vibrant musical life. Steuterman grew up here as a chorister in Calvary's well-established music program led by R. Jefferson Hall. Hall enlisted him to play for services as he was his student, and Steuterman continued as Calvary's organist when Hall left to take another position. In 1914, Steuterman went to New York City to study at the Guillemot Organ School, one of the first academies established in this country to offer superb training as a church organist. Previously, American organists who wanted to pursue high-level instruction had only one option: to travel abroad to study with the European masters in France and Germany. While at the Guillemot School, Steuterman received instruction in organ playing and music theory, in choir training both for boys and adults, in hymnody and organ tuning, a very important skill. Steuterman also studied organ and choral repertoire with T. Tertius Noble, who was organist choirmaster at St. Thomas, Fifth Avenue. Noble had been brought from Old York, York Minster Cathedral in England, to New York to establish a choir school based on the English cathedral tradition. Steuterman was not his assistant. He actually held part-time positions as organist choirmaster for consecutive years at the Dutch Reformed Church in Elmhurst and All Souls Episcopal, New York City. But he was fortunate to serve as accompanist for the St. Thomas Festival Chorus, which presented oratorios with orchestra at least twice a year. It's important to note all that Steuterman was doing at the time. In modern terms, he was a full-time student with a part-time church job and an internship. Would keep one busy for sure. I was curious to find out if St. Thomas had an archive of past programs in which I might find Steuterman's name. I contacted the music staff, and they were actually very prompt in responding and generous with their time. Within a couple of weeks, they sent me not just a program, but pictures of every page of Noble's service logs during the years that Steuterman was there. What fun it was to get that email with all those records, especially when they said, "We found your guy." On the table is a printout of a program of a concert offered on December 21st, 1916, on the feast day of St. Thomas, in which you can see Steuterman listed both as a chorus member and an organist in the performance of the Brahms Requiem. So in asking for a trinket, they actually sent me a treasure chest. Looking at Noble's service logs, I saw that the mentor passed along an important skill to his mentee, that of record keeping. And it's so interesting to look and see that Steuterman actually kept a lot more detail of each service, but Noble still had the same layout that Steuterman followed. So Steuterman's journal is also there, the one that I consulted the most. Every page of that is 1921 to 1924. So again, you're welcome to see that at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about what the organ world was like at the time. The early 20th century was an exciting time to study the organ. European virtuoso organists like Alexandre Guillemot of Paris and Englishman Edwin Lemaire were generating immense popular interest in the instrument with their extended US recital tours. So not only were American organists going abroad to study, finally organists from Europe were coming and starting to spread this centuries-long tradition of fine organ playing. So, and when they came, they brought this technique. They had this technique that was flawless, and it was both manuals and pedals, manuals and feet. So this is something that American audiences had not seen to that point. Guillemot brought the repertoire of the European tradition and impressed his audiences by playing it flawlessly. Lemaire was a champion of transcriptions and delighted people with his mastery of registration and technique. No doubt, listeners who did not prefer serious music would have been simply won over by the command of the machinery that these two performers exhibited. Their performances offered audiences an easy conduit from popular music heard on a theater organ to art music played on a pipe organ. As a result, there was a demand for more and larger instruments, which were built not just in churches, but in civic auditoriums and homes of the rich and famous, too. Dining rooms had pipe organs in them at the time. Cities that couldn't fund an entire symphony orchestra recognized that they could install a large pipe organ in an auditorium and hire one person instead of an entire orchestra, an organist who could play recitals that could include orchestral favorites transcribed for organ. In fact, not far from here, the city of Chattanooga did that very thing and hired Edwin Lemaire to be its municipal organist in 1924. At the same time, there was a desire to professionalize the occupation of an organist, which resulted not only in the founding of schools to train church organists, like the Guillemot Organ School, with his American student, William Carl, but also the founding of a professional organization, the American Guild of Organists, the AGO. The AGO offered certification by examination, which at the time validated an organist's skill level because higher ed institutions did not confer degrees at the time. Steuterman earned his associate and fellowship certifications in 1916 and 17, respectively, which translates in modern terms to his master's and his doctorate degrees. By the end of his studies in New York City, Steuterman had the technique, credentials, and high-level professional experience to land him a job at a large church in any major city. But there was a war going on, And Steuterman enlisted in the army and served in France for a year during World War I. Upon his return to the U.S., he was hired by the Reverend William Buckner to serve as Calvary's Organist-Choirmaster back in Memphis. June 15, 1919 was his first service here at Calvary. And there's actually a plaque with William Buckner's name on the back wall, the rector who hired him. And I since learned that he died. William Buckner died 1 year later after hiring Steuterman in 1920. And this is poignant, being unable to hold a service indoors because of rampant influenza. Calvary was only able to have a graveside service for him at Elmwood Cemetery. So how much music was required of Steuterman at the time? Well, he played a prelude and postlude every Sunday. Morning prayer was the main liturgy, but when Eucharist was offered once a month, he played an additional 6 to 8 pieces during the distribution of communion. These pieces were short, about 3 to 4 minutes in length, and unlike today's practices, they were not based on hymn tunes and actually rarely corresponded to the liturgical season. Maintaining a tradition set by Jefferson Hall, Steuterman played weekly recitals during the 6-week season of Lent. Weekly recitals, whether for a season or an entire year, were a regular feature of many large churches in metropolitan areas. Repertoire lists of these recitals were published regularly in professional journals, which is how I discovered this and knew what was being played. Again, we knew what was being played in recitals, but not what was being played on Sunday mornings. Steuterman's recital programming most certainly educated his audience because he was playing works of the European masters. These recitals must have enthralled them with his technique and entertained them by playing popular styles of music. His recitals of 8 to 10 pieces always included a major work by J.S. Bach and often one of the French symphonists, a transcription of a movement from one of Wagner's operas, and a vocal solo sung by different members of the Calvary Choir. This is actually a huge amount of music when you take that times 6, which he was doing weekly. And then on top of that, of course, one Eucharist Sunday in Lent would come around, and so then he was playing an additional 8 to 10 pieces that day. So for a total of 18 to 20 pieces on one day, and then he still had the next 5 weeks of recitals and preludes and postludes. So during these 3 years that I looked at, Steuterman played nearly 250 different pieces of music. Looking at all of that, I created a table. This is Dr. Kreitner's famous recommendation, and this, because it actually helps reveal a lot of things. I created a table of the repertoire played, noting the title and composer, the dates of the composer, whether it was played on a Sunday morning or in recital, and the instrument or ensemble for which it was originally composed. In addition, I tallied the number of times Steuterman performed each piece. I found that the pieces naturally fell into 4 categories, which I call the classics, the contemporary works, the characteristic and exotic, and transcriptions. So let's start with the classics. The 36 pieces in Steuterman's repertoire categorized as classics include the organ solos written before the 20th century by prominent French and German organists like Bach, Franck, Liszt, Widor, Vierne, and of course, Guillemot. You don't study at the Guillemot organ school without getting out and playing a few works by Guillemot. I opened tonight's recital with In Dearest Freude by J.S. Bach, a piece from Bach's Orgelbuchlein. Steuterman played it in February of 1923, which happened to fall in Lent, and he played it in church and then in recital that same afternoon. He was practical by doing that. It reduced his practice time for one piece that 1 week. Based on a German hymn, a German chorale, In Thee is Gladness is a bit shorter compared to the rest of the pieces in this category. These were primarily large-scale works which were composed using the established forms at the time: sonata, symphony, chorale prelude, a variation set, fantasy, fugue, and they explored counterpoint and harmony and required the technical facility of a well-trained organist. Looking through a 21st century lens, we see these pieces as works that have endured the test of time. They continue to be studied in the academy, are still frequently performed on recitals, and demonstrate a performer's command of the instrument. Their length and complexity landed them most often on one of Steuterman's recital programs rather than on a Sunday morning. Most of the works in this category of classics are quite well known, so I think it would be more interesting to discuss and play the music written in the early 1900s. As I mentioned before, the organ world was becoming popularized and professionalized. As the pipe organ's appeal spread across the country, jobs became more prevalent and demand for skilled organists increased. Church musicians like Steuterman needed a large body of repertoire, obviously, that was easy to learn to meet the demands of the job. Therefore, a flurry of organ composition occurred in early 20th century America. At the same time, there were debates about what music organists should play. Not that. First, there was the question of whether to play only high-quality music, for example, cultivated polyphonic traditions coming out of Europe, or was it appropriate to play music of a more popular style, like that which was being heard in the theater? Should one play only music written for the organ? What music was appropriate for church? For a recital? Could it function in both? Publishing houses wanting to sell copies of the newly composed music appealed to the emerging attitude toward church music. In one of their ads, Fisher and Brothers boldly stated, "None of these are what the organist knows as straight organ music, but they are attractive genre pieces, particularly melodious, just the kind that the average congregation vastly prefers to a dose of Bach." So let's take a look at this next category of pieces, the contemporary works. The contemporary works are roughly divided between composers who wanted to retain the old forms and imitative devices coming out of Europe, and those who embraced a more popular style of America. Of the more conservative composers, Steuterman most frequently played works of Enrico Bossi, and he played them in recital. Bossi was from Italy, and Italy was not actually known for producing organists and organ composers, but Bossi was extraordinary and toured extensively. While he was in Paris, he befriended some of France's finest organists, César Franck, Alexandre Guillemot, and Marcel Dupré. Bossi wrote idiomatically for the instrument, so his pieces sound a lot harder than they actually are to play. I'd like to play a portion of his delightful scherzo in G minor. Its pleasant melodies and dramatic crescendos to full organ were just the sorts of things that appealed to the modern audience. And after that, I'll play just the beginning, the first page of his Études symphoniques, a piece that he dedicated to Alexandre Guillemot. It was a common practice at this time for composers to dedicate pieces to the organists that they admired. It starts off with a rather cliché melody in octaves on full organ, followed by a passage showcasing the pedals. The hands pretty much have a rest, but the pedals start going crazy, which gives a nod to its dedicataire, Guillemot, the man who brought pedal technique to the rest of the world. Well, so you heard a bit of the contemporary works a la classic style trying to be brought over here, but the next bit that I'd like to talk about in the contemporary category were Steuterman's postludes. Their titles help to give a sense of their purpose. They have titles like Sortie in D minor or Festal Postlude, and that indicates the context and place in which they should be played at the end of a church service as people leave. Most are not complicated, but serviceable and easy to learn. Many of these pieces are marches, which was a very popular genre at the time. And Steuterman played the rustic march, the march triomphal, the march pittoresque, the nuptial march, the triumphal march, the festal march. And if they didn't have march in their title, they were still often based on a typical march structure. I'd like to highlight two such pieces next. Festival March by Ralph Kinder and Festal Postlude by Oskar Schminke. Ralph Kinder was born in England and studied with the English recitalist Edwin Lemaire. Kinder immigrated to the US to take the job at Holy Trinity Episcopal Church in Philadelphia and became a well-known recitalist himself, performing over 1,000 recitals in his lifetime. Following his piece, I'll play Festal Postlude by Oskar Schminke. I've chosen to play this piece because Schminke was not actually an organist by profession. He was a dentist who had a zeal for the instrument. He didn't write a lot of organ music, only 7 pieces, but it was performed frequently by organists around the country. We know this because of the recital lists published in the professional journals. An organ aficionado, Schminke also traveled abroad to hear and play organs in France and Germany. His knowledge of organ building was deep, and organists actually looked to him as an expert on the organs built by Zilbermann, which was the builder of the instruments that Bach played. Schminke dedicated this piece, Festal Postlude, to Edwin Kraft, an American who studied with Widor and Gilmont. Kraft was the city organist of Atlanta at the time. Mind you, it was smaller than Memphis. And eventually, Kraft was quite an accomplished individual, and he eventually went on to become the head of the organ department at the Cleveland Institute of Music. Steuterman played both of these pieces frequently as postludes, at least twice a year. And Festal Postlude he also played in recital. In 1922, the editor of AGO's professional journal, The American Organist, T. Scott Berman, suggested that preludes should set a religious atmosphere, and postludes should serve as a transition from the religious atmosphere to the outside world, retaining, however, a general religious character rather than a worldly one. I wonder if you'll find these two postludes achieve that effect. let's move on to the characteristic and exotic works. The popular characteristic and exotic pieces were composed primarily by the Americans. Their purpose was to evoke an emotion, a season or time, a state of being, or an exotic land. Some of them depict a particular thing or entity. These were Steuterman's preludes and communion pieces, and were well received on his recitals. Let's look first at the characteristic pieces. Unlike program music, which depicts the evolution of an event or the development of a character over time, characteristic pieces are more simplistic, like a quick view or a snapshot image. They have titles like Moonlight, Jour de Printemps, Serenade, Cradle Song, and Prayer. Their registration was formulaic. Composers frequently liked to use the softer string and flute stops to accompany a melody on a gentle reed. Even though their titles suggested very different things, prayer, sleep, evening, autumn, spring, the registrations were usually the same. Together, the title and the colorful registrations were to draw a listener in by creating a dreamlike effect or perhaps a religious atmosphere. You recall the words of the editor of the AGO's professional journal, preludes should set a religious atmosphere. And in addition, he's playing these pieces during communion. So again, a prayerful type of atmosphere. So that same journal, the American Organist, published a feature on a modern composer, J. Frank Freisinger, who I'll be playing in just a minute. This feature was written by an AGO founding member, J. Warren Andrews. Andrews offered the evolving perspective of the day. He writes, "Harking back to my early student days, I remember the absolutely dry stuff we had put before us for church preludes or voluntaries." And he goes on and lists a number of German composers' names. I am glad to welcome the more melodious and interesting compositions of Freisinger, which fall within the range of the ability of the rising young organist. Composers often printed an epigraph to help evoke the desired effect. So I've printed some of them in the front of your program that you might want to refer to in these next few minutes. These characteristic pieces are so similar in style. As a little experiment, I'd like to play these next three pieces in no particular order, not the order that they're printed in your program, which is Moonlight, Oh, the Lilting Springtime, and The Swan. So I'm going to mix them up and see, I'm going to quiz you afterward and see if you can guess which piece I played first, second, and third. Moonlight by J. Frank Freisinger, which incidentally was dedicated to the American Organist's editor, Scott Berman. Oh, the Lilting Springtime by Charles Stebbins, and The Swan, which is based on a poem about a dying swan by Alfred Lloyd Tennyson, also by Stebbins. I played Moonlight first. How many of you guessed Moonlight first? Second was, Oh, the Lilting Springtime. Oh, no, that's wrong. Sorry, second was the Swan. Anyone get the Swan? All right, and then third was, most people got the Swan. Very impressive. Is that, I guess maybe because it ends minor and he's like dying or something. Maybe the epigraph helped. I don't know. How fun. So, as you recall, these are the types of pieces that Steuterman played for preludes and during the distribution of communion. Quite a difference from what happens here in many places, I'm sure. He didn't play them on recital programs. They were easy to play, quiet pieces with garden variety melodies. Sometimes composers were able to capture the essence of their subject a little more realistically with the colors available on the organ. Edwin Lemaire wrote a suite called Summer Sketches. I'm going to play an excerpt of a movement from that called The Bee, using one of the organ stops called the Vox Humana, which is strangely saying it characterizes the human voice, but that would be a little unfortunate if we sang that way. But it has a really unique sound. It's a very cool sound, but it's not usually what people would expect when you hear that it's a Vox Humana, human voice. So using the Vox Humana and trills, the sound of the bee is aptly produced in the left hand, but it's not a happy little bee as the epigraph suggests. Well, clearly he didn't play that in church, but on a recital. It doesn't really seem to set up an atmosphere of prayer, maybe something more like anxiety. But that leads us to the second half of this category, the exotics. The exotics were strictly recital material, and they take the listener's imagination one step further than the characteristic works. With creative registrations, they attempt to transport the listener to far-off places like Egypt, Russia, Persia, or the Orient. And some go so far as to use elements of non-Western music, using things like the whole tone scale, or the gypsy scale with the raised fourth, or the pentatonic scale, parallel fourths and fifths. While Steuterman was studying in New York City, music critic D.C. Parker published an article in 1917 that defined exoticism as something enticingly foreign in that it spins out of the artist's imagination, full of adventure and surprise. The 1893 World's Fair in Chicago that introduced Gilman's magnificent organ technique to the American audience had a profound influence on late 19th century popular culture in another way. It introduced the Middle and Far East to crowds of thousands. And Americans became entranced by this, and their appetite for the Oriental experience was insatiable. Steuterman knew the value of this popular style of piece and programmed it often on his Lenten organ recitals. The composer best known for writing exotic works was Roy Stoughton, who was called a depictor of Eastern characteristics. He excelled at writing engaging pieces that turned audiences into explorers of far-off lands, both real and fantastical, without having to leave their seats. In a strange twist, writing music descriptive of other parts of the world was what made an organist from Massachusetts so popular, and at the time earned Stoughton the reputation for establishing the American School of Composers by other organists, I should say. Although Staughton wrote over 50 characteristic and exotic pieces, he's now completely unknown. I could hardly find any biographical information about him other than he was from Massachusetts. Steuterman played various suites of his, and they were ones that took audiences to Persia, to Egypt, Arcadia, Samarkand, and also a fairyland. Steuterman was surely aware of his home city's association with ancient Egypt when he chose to learn Staughton's Egyptian suite. It serves as a special point of local interest to focus on two movements from the Egyptian suite, Pyramids and Ramses II. Coincidentally, some 70 years later after he was playing these works, Memphis would find that it had its own pyramid and a statue of Ramses II just a few blocks from Calvary Episcopal. In 2012, after the pyramid became a Bass Pro Shop, the statue of Ramses II was moved to the Central Avenue entrance to the University of Memphis campus, an institution of which I will soon be a proud alum. In the first movement of the Egyptian suite, Staughton captures the mystery of centuries-old death that resides in a pyramid with musical gestures that might be interpreted as spiders and specters. At the very beginning, the outline of a pyramid shape is actually depicted in the rise and fall of the first melody, played on two different orchestral reed stops, the oboe and the French horn. And this is a feature of many of the instruments at the time. The organ building in the early 20th century was very much focused on replicating sounds of the orchestra. The next movement that I'll play is actually the last movement of the suite. The celebrated power of the Egyptian ruler Ramses II is captured in loud fistfuls of chords at the outset of this movement. And yet, in both of these movements, even with the organ registration and use of parallel fourths and whole tone and pentatonic scales, there are certain musical phrases that will bring us right back to the music of the 1920s played on a theater organ. right, our final category is transcriptions. Transcriptions were wildly popular, and Steuterman played pieces written for solo instruments like violin and piano, as well as orchestral favorites and movements and overtures of operas. Many transcriptions were published by the well-known American recitalists, but I wouldn't be surprised if Steuterman played his own arrangement of a piece. He certainly had the ability and knew the repertoire. Remember, his musical family played piano and violin. He accompanied an oratorio chorus in New York City, and in 1922, he established the Memphis Opera Club. A lecture recital about Steuterman's repertoire would not be complete without playing a work from a Wagner opera, since he played one on every Lenten organ recital. So I'm going to play the Pilgrim's Chorus from Tannhäuser, arranged by Clarence Eddy. By the 1920s, the world was embracing the pipe organ and demanding more. If only that were the case of the 2020s. But anyway, in 1920, not wanting to disappoint their listeners, American organists responded by writing prolific amounts of music that were more in line with the musical tastes of the general public. They were completely unhampered by the traditions of the Europeans and saw this as an opportunity to establish their own style. Seeing the profession of church musician in its earliest stages, it's not surprising that Adolph Steuterman played this eclectic mix of pieces. In fact, it demonstrates that he was a student of the repertoire, a master of the instrument, and an educator of his audience. He purposely chose to play music relevant to the time. And by reading the comments that he wrote after each recital in the side margins of his journal, we learned that he enjoyed a great degree of success because large audiences came to hear his recitals week after week, year after year. And it's no doubt that he had won them over to begin with on Sunday mornings. From our vantage point, much of this repertoire might now be described or even dismissed as mere period pieces. And the many early 20th century American organist composers discussed here will probably remain obscure. Over the last 100 years, organ composers have continued to write for the organ, but have written more purposely for a sacred context, basing works on hymn tunes, and organists have played them in the appropriate liturgical seasons. Still, a modern organist might take note. Wise repertoire choices, blending the well-liked with the more academic, can help to secure the organ's place in American music culture by winning the congregation and audience over to the instrument. As a close, I'd like to play one of the pieces that Steuterman played most often, the March Pittoresque by Ernest Kroger.